Shalom everyone, you're all here again with another episode of Tzar Mikra. Unfortunately, there is a lot of noise in my area today, so there might be some background noise, especially a dog barking. So again, I want to welcome everyone again to another episode of Tzar Mikra. This week we are in Parashat Beshalach. I'm actually using a new microphone here, so I hope it solves some of the sound issues and the problems that some people have told me exist with the sound, volume not being high enough and things like that. So I'm actually using a new microphone, and hopefully this will do the job right and give the best quality sound possible. And there the dog goes again. There's a lot of noise here. The dog is very, very upset. This neighbor of mine has a dog in a yard, and the yard functions as a boombox, and basically the dog's bark is amplified. In any case, I know this is probably doesn't really interest anyone, but I just want to make the point of this is why I have so much background noise. Even with a high-end microphone, it's still very difficult to get rid of all the noise, but I have to make the recording now. Anyhow, after chit-chat of over a minute, Parashat Beshalach. This is a very interesting parasha. I think most parashot are very interesting. There are a few that feel repetitive, especially in the book of Exodus and the book of Shemot, which we have to, every time a teacher does a teaching on the book of Exodus, it's very difficult to work through, and you have to kind of play around with the material to be able to teach, and I had this issue many, many times. In any case, this parasha also has a few interesting midrashim, which I will be talking about a little bit. I will not be doing an intensive study of the Song on the Sea, because that will take a very, very long time to do, and I try to keep these recordings in a certain limit, and really to keep it under a very specific number of subjects. In any case, Beshalach. So first of all, the root shalach, to send, kind of sometimes gives me the connotation of sending away to some degree forcefully, and the term shalach, by the way, also appears again in Parashat Yitro, that Yitro brings back Tzipora achar shiluchea, that she was sent away. And it kind of gives me a bit of a feeling connected to the whole concept of the divorce idea, sending away through trying to remove the person permanently. So Pharaoh, there's an interesting dynamic here regarding how Pharaoh perceives what's happening, how the Israelites perceive what's happening, and kind of this tension, this tension, by the way, shows up later on in the writings of Manetho, who was a Egyptian priest in the 2nd century BC, who was highly offended by what the Bible says about the Egyptians, that he openly attacked Jews in Israel. It's kind of the first elements of anti-Semitism, like real anti-Semitism that we hear from the ancient world. Anti-Semitism really starts showing up more with the Romans, because the Romans, like many Western cultures, had very little respect to anything that wasn't Roman, to the point where they call them barbarians and so on. And it's anti-Semitism really starts off as just a blatant elitistic, European elitistic mentality, which fed a lot of these ideas for many centuries. But what's interesting here is this argument that Beshalach Paro, when he personally sent them away, threw them out of Egypt, but then later on it says Israel yotzim beyad rama. Israel went out with a stretched out arm, which is a symbol of strength and power. And what's interesting here as well, it says on the one hand, Israel is presented as very strong, going forward, maybe even an element of being armed. I'll talk about that in a moment. But it also says, "Velo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim ki karov hu." He did not lead them through the road of the Philistines, for it is near. And the fear was that they will see battle and turn around. Now there are several interesting things here. First of all, the derech eretz plishtim, which seems to be the northern road. Basically, if you go through Egypt, travel through the northern Sinai Peninsula, you're basically traveling on one of the important routes. There were several routes that existed at the time, and almost every last one of them actually went through the land of Israel. This is why the land of Israel was economically very, very important up to about, I would say, the moment they started using commercial airliners. Prior to that, when you had to travel by road or by boat, you were limited to very specific places, and going through the land of Israel was a route that was very comfortable, because the other options was to go through Jordan of today, which is desert. So there were several routes. So one of them was also known as the Route of the Sea, which is still used to this very day, and actually has several sections. One of them actually travels near Yokneam of today. If you remember, I posted on my website images from the ancient Yokneam, the biblical Yokneam, which is adjacent to the entrance from the west, I would say northeastern side of modern day Yokneam. It's a tel. If you ever come to the area of Haifa and you want to see it, you can call me up and send me an email, and I can take you there and show you things. And what we find very interesting is that these roads are used to this very day. So there was the Road of the Sea. There was also another place known as the Road of the King, which was very close to the Road of the Sea. And there was also the route through the mountains, what's known today as Route 60. Still exists to this very day. You can actually walk on that route. The road itself, Road 60, is a couple hundred yards away from the original road, but the original road was used up to about 30 years ago, something like that, and you can actually go visit that road and see it. So if you're ever south of Jerusalem in Gush Etzion, you can also see that. That was actually in Gush Etzion last week, and I actually have some videos from there, which I'm planning on putting up on YouTube. And then you have the road of the valley, the Jordan Valley, the Route 90, which is more or less on the same route as well. And then you have the Route of the Desert, which is already in Transjordan. But these roads basically went through the northern part of Israel and then split either to Asia Minor and then into Europe or into Mesopotamia. So the road he's talking about here is part of the road that connects to the Way of the Sea, and it's a very quick route. I mean, basically cutting through the northern part next to the ocean and then cut through into the land of Israel. And what's interesting here is, what is this fear of war? So we need to understand that the Israelites walked out of Egypt strongly. They weren't cast out of Egypt. They actually walked out of Egypt with a strong arm, which is a symbol of strength. But the point is that they weren't prepared for war yet. They're not ready mentally. They don't feel free yet. This is part of the tension with the Song on the Sea, and everything comes before it. They're still afraid of the Egyptians. They're still afraid of dealing with the Egyptians. But you think, where are the Philistines? So a lot of Midrashim speak about arriving on the border in front of the Philistines and having to battle them. But actually, when you look at it archaeologically wise, what it's actually talking about is fortifications, Egyptian fortifications, which were on that road. So if they traveled on that road, the Egyptian fortifications will be a threat. And God doesn't want them to battle the Egyptians face to face. This is his battle. This is what he is leading the Israelites into, fighting against the Egyptians. God is the one who's going to do this fight, no one else. And it's set up in that way. The entire idea here is that God is battling against human beings, but also symbolically fighting gods. And I will explain that in a moment as well. So he actually takes them through a place known as Derech HaMidbar, which basically probably travels through the center of the Sinai Peninsula. So you can already understand that my opinion about the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, or Yam Suf, which is another question by itself, was not from Egypt to the Sinai Peninsula, but from the Sinai Peninsula into Saudi Arabia. It seems to be very clear that is the situation. And because the land of Goshen is northeastern Egypt, that's where the Israelites were mostly at. Upper Egypt was actually in the south, where all the kings were. That was actually in the south, not the north. The north was the farmland, basically the delta of the Nile and so on. So what we have here is traveled through the center of the Sinai Peninsula all the way to Pi Hahirot, and there's some theories where Pi Hahirot is. Pi Hahirot, by the way, is probably a corruption of Pi Charchat or Charchort, which is a Egyptian deity. It's very important for understanding what goes on here. And it's in front of a place known as Baal Tzafon, which is another deity. Baal is a Canaanite god. Tzafon is the dwelling place of the god El. And Migdol, some people understand Migdol. Migdol comes from the word Migdal, which is a tower. This actually might be another kind of desert-dwelling temple. And it's interesting, so we have Piachirot, that might be a reference to Egyptian goddess, which seems to be like a little enclave of earth, of like a tongue that sticks out into the Red Sea of today. And it basically sticks out. It's like there's like a little bay there, and it's created by the earth sticking out, very sharply sticking out into the ocean. And we have Migdol, that might be a temple of some sort. We find towers were temples. Israel Finkelstein, for example, in his digs in Megiddo, mentions a tower temple, a 10th century or maybe even earlier than that, temple that was built like a tower. And we also find that Baalei Berit Shechem, in the book of Judges, we have Avimelech, who battles against the leaders of the city of Shechem, and he specifically attacks the city, and they run into a tower, and it's known as the Migdal Baal Brit Shechem, something like that, and they run into the thing known as the Tzariach. The Tzariach is probably the fortification of the tower, but the tower itself seems to be dedicated to this Baal Berit. So it's a Baal who is known as Baal Berit, some kind of a manifestation, some kind of another version of the god Baal, and they run into this tower and they hide in it. So there seems to be that Migdol, being a very similar version of the word Migdal, is actually some kind of temple of some sort. So we have basically what I can call a showdown between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt, the gods of Canaan, and the gods of the south, basically the desert dwellers. So the placing here of the specific characters and specific names is very, very interesting. Now, another thing that it says here in verse 18 is that they went out chamushim. Now, I've seen some people trying to explain what chamushim is. There was even a very, I would say, fun word study that someone put out, mostly based on modern Hebrew, which is a mistake that people make. Chamushim can be a lot of different things. There are a lot of opinions about this. And there are a lot of commentators that write what the different opinions are. So chamushim can mean armed. The modern Hebrew word for armed is chamush, is based on something biblical. Another possibility here is that they went out in units, that they were structured like a military unit. That chamushim means to be military organized, basically in little camps, and they traveled in this very specific formation, which by this point is mostly squares. That's another opinion that exists. So it's still military, but it takes it not from the point of being armed, but from the point of being organized like a military camp, which is, by the way, very reasonable. We actually find in the Second Temple, especially in the book that the sons of light versus the sons of darkness, Bnei Or Ubnei Choshech, sectarian writing from the Second Temple, they emphasize the idea of the military mindset of Israel, the military mindset of the desert. And the desert, the Midbar, is a very important feature in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they kind of romanticize the idea of going back to the time of the desert when they were led by God himself, which really fits some of the mentality of the zealots. I used to say zealots. I used to say that when people used to make fun of me. The zealots of the time, and they wanted to be governed by God himself. A very good representation of this, by the way, was actually in the 1970s movie Masada, either the miniseries or the movie itself. The movie itself is just basically they took the miniseries and kind of chopped it up and put it up into one long movie. And the mentality there of Elazar ben Yair really represents the mentality they had of the only king above us is the God of Israel, And they probably picked this up out of the Bible, by the way, because Shmuel presents this idea of God is your king and you're asking for a human king here. Another option which appears in the Midrash about Chamushim is the word Chamishit, which means a fifth. There are some teachers out there who use this Midrash. I was even specifically asked by someone if this is historically accurate. And the answer is probably no. We need to understand where the Midrashim take their ideas from, why the Midrashim say certain things. And we need to understand that Midrashim were sometimes set in a time where people were dealing with, say, Jews turning away from Torah, turning away from their own people. So the Midrash was trying to say, even at that time, when Israel was coming out of Egypt, even then God didn't have a problem of leaving people behind who were not interested. So they were saying even if 80% of Israel doesn't survive, we know that there will always be a remnant somewhere, and God will always be loyal to that remnant. And if you decide to abandon Torah, that's your problem. Don't worry, we're going to survive. And the thing is, this mentality exists. This mentality exists in very, 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 very extreme groups that exist in Judaism. That they really don't care about everyone else, but they don't care about anyone else in general. So it's more of a psychological problem than real Torah. You can't use them as an example. Very commonly people would use, oh, look what this Jew said and what that Jew said. Look what Yoel said as well, if it's happened before. And you just have to be very careful. People have opinions, but that's them. It doesn't represent the majority of Israel, does not represent the majority of Jews. So it seems to me that Midrash is obviously historically inaccurate, especially with the fact that the text tells us that they also had Erev Rav, a mixed multitude that joined them. The Egyptians were more than happy to get rid of the Israelites, and I think the Israelites were more than happy to leave. So I'm very doubtful about that Midrash. But what's interesting about this term Chomesh is actually there are indicators that this can talk about being armed, but the arming element is a little different. The Chomesh seems to be an area somewhere between either parts of the ribs or the belly. And people who bear swords usually have a sword strapped in a position, especially in the ancient Near East, but also even in the East itself. The scabbard of the sword usually reaches a pretty high point in the person's body. And so Chamushim can actually relate to being armed, but armed has to do, etymologically probably has to do with the fifth rib or something in that area where the scabbard actually sits near that place. That's probably the etymology of the term chamush, to be armed, that you're actually carrying a weapon near your ribs. And we find the term chomesh as a rib area with Avner, the Avishai in the book of Samuel, second book of Samuel, kills Avner ben Ner. He murders him. One of the people of Avner ben Ner, one of the people of the house of the court of King Saul, and he stabs him by kill el hachomesh. He struck him at the chomesh. Basically, he stabbed him in the chest area, in the place known as the chomesh, which is somewhere in an area where if you get stabbed there, you probably die very quickly. But he stabbed him somewhere in the belly, chest area. So we have that as well. So the Israelites reached this point. I don't need to narrate the story here. It's pretty straightforward. But what's interesting here as well, something about how movies affect the way we perceive the knowledge of the Torah. In most movies, the Egyptians are presented as if they are struggling on the shores of the sea, where the text actually says that they were in the attack by the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, not smoke. People use that term smoke, and it is incorrect. It is a cloud. The word used is anan. Okay, one of the reasons some people want to say smoke is because there's this idea that in the ancient world, military units, if they had to travel and there were large units, they would have one or even more people in the front carrying torches on these very, very long staffs, so they could see. During the day, they could see the smoke, and during the night, they could see the glow of the fire. And it's the same idea what goes on here, but the usage of the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke, or pillar of cloud actually, is on the same mentality, but it's an actual pillar. This pillar has the ability to move from one place to the other. But what's interesting is that it says here that the pillar traveled from the camp of Israel to the camp of Egypt, but it actually says also in the same breath that the Egyptians were in the ocean. Okay? And it says the water split, and it says in verse 23, and Egypt chased after them into the water, El Toch Hayam, into the sea ocean itself. So this struggle that's presented in Hollywood and all movies, that they are struggling with the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud on the shore itself, is not true. It was actually happening inside the water. Now, another midrash that exists is, actually I'm skipping around here a little bit, so I do apologize, but I want to keep things in one bulk and then jump into another bulk. Another interesting thing is that there's actually an idiomatic expression here which appears in verse 13. It says, verse 14 says, Adonai lachem lachem vatem tacharishon. The Lord will fight for you and you will be silent. And someone asked me what this term actually means, to be silent, and laharish actually means to not act. It doesn't have to do with necessarily speaking, though haresh is actually one that does not hear, so the charishun is to be silent. And the idea here is that they will be without action. And an interesting parallel, an interesting usage of this root haitre-shin, better not to be confused with the root harash, which is to plow. It's very important to remember, even if words share roots or presumably share roots, it does not mean they share a meaning. Cheresh is someone who is deaf. Harash is someone who is plowing, or someone who plowed the ground. But what's interesting here is this is another idiomatic expression with the sense of not acting. And we have the same term used in the book of Esther, where when Mordechai goes and speaks with Esther, and he tells her, you have to go act, and he says, and she seems to be refusing, he says to her, Maharesh taharishi ka'et hazot. Revach v'atzela yeh leYehudim mimakom acher. I'm paraphrasing here. And if you will be silent, if you surely be silent, a redemption will be to the Jews from another place. I'm paraphrasing. Please don't catch me on the word. And he basically means that if you're not going to speak in the sense of acting, if you're not going to do something to help out your own people, the salvation will come from somewhere else. But there's an interesting connection here as well, the whole salvation thing. That sometimes you have to act, sometimes you don't have to act. And the problem that Judaism has to deal with these days, modern day Judaism has to deal with, is the salvation going to be something that we have to act upon, or something that we just sit back and relax and let God do it? And I think that the words of Mordechai resonate this idea, and you can specifically play the game of Aharesh Taharishi. This is not the times of the Exodus. Back then there was a point of God doing everything. But now we are in a different time. We are in a time that we have to act as well. God gives us the tools, and we have to act. There was a point to be made in the entire Exodus, and this is why Israel has to be silent. But there are certain actions you have to do, because God says to Moses, why do you yell out to me? I told you I'm going to take care of this. It's still traveling. So it's not as if necessarily completely sitting back. The battle is by God. Okay, this is why God is referred to as Ish Milchama. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you see God fighting for you, you need to step aside. You need to start moving. You need to start listening. The idea here is, why are you yelling? I told you I'm going to take care of this. Okay? Moses himself said, you'll be silent. But then there's a contrast here. He says, why are you yelling out to me? There's a lot of issues going on here simultaneously. It's actually rushing through my head. There's another point. So for those who know me, sometimes I go through rabbit trails. And it's interesting here that he says, you'll be silent, but then suddenly he says, God says, why do you yell out to me? Moses has a responsibility here. To be a leader means that you sometimes have to accommodate the people around you, even if you disagree with them. And because Moses realized that the people were distressed and they weren't too sure, he joined them in prayer. But God is turning around to Moses and saying, there you're actually wrong. Just tell them to stop moving. A leader can make mistakes, and this might be a mistake of Moses. Moses made a calculation here that he needs to step in and call out with the children of Israel. And God says, listen, this calculation is wrong. So even a leader like Moses can make a mistake. Maybe that's what's mentioned here. Then the pillars themselves. It says in verse 19, "Vayisa malach Elohim haolech lifnei machanei Yisrael, vayilech ma'acharehem." It says that the messenger of Elohim, who walks before the camp of Israel, traveled behind them. But then the other half of the verse says, "Vayisa amud ha'anan mipnehem," and the pillar of smoke traveled from before them and stood behind them. So this is what we call it actually has a very specific term. There's so many terms I can't remember everything. But this is basically a verse that explains itself. One half makes a statement, the other half basically is a parenthetical clause which explains what goes on. It's basically an entrance. What does it mean? What does this angel show up from? We haven't heard of angels at all up to this point. Or malachim, messengers. So it clarifies and says, the messenger of Elohim mentioned here is actually the pillar of cloud. But this is interesting. It doesn't say that God is the one who travels before them. At least that's how I remember it. At least most of us remember it. And it says in verse 21, it's verse 21 of chapter 13, "Va'adonai holech lifneim yomam ba'amud anan chotam haderech." And the Lord, Yud Hei Vav Hei, walks before them during the day, or yomam actually means throughout the day. It doesn't mean just day. It's actually an adverbial function of time throughout the day. Be'amud anan chotam haderech, in a pillar of cloud to lead them on the way. Valayla be'amud esh la'ir lahem, and at night, and a pillar of fire to illuminate for them. Lalechet yomam v'layla, so they can walk day and night, which is, by the way, important. It explains how they were able to travel through the entire desert. They probably had very quick breaks of rest, and then they slept a little bit and then carried on. So they were traveling day and night, basically. And then it says there's the malach here. So I've been asked about this quite a few times. I think it was even a discussion over a year ago I had with a very good friend of mine on Facebook, which I haven't heard from for a very long time. But it made me think here that, is it possible that 99% of the time where God appears before someone, it's not actually God himself, it's a manifestation? Could it explain the nature of basic angels, that they are manifestations of the will of God, they are extensions of the will of God, and not actual pure entities? Is it possible that God doesn't almost ever actually show up in our realm of existence, our plane of existence, because the sheer magnitude of the appearance of God on our plane just will almost destroy the world? I mean, think about the revelation of Mount Sinai, Ma'amad al Sinai. God appears, the mountain starts burning, descriptions of loud noises, maybe even somewhat of an earthquake, and that says that God descended on the mountain. That's the one place where it seems to be, excuse me, where God himself actually shows up by himself. And any other time, it's a messenger of some sort. And even in Mount Sinai, there's a question, did God speak the whole time or only part of the time? We'll deal with that maybe next time. But what's interesting here is, first of all, the fact that it states to us that the pillar is actually a messenger. It's not God himself. But the messenger takes the role of the one who sent him. And this was a very, very common thing in the ancient world, that a messenger, when he bears the message, he is like as if that person stands before you. So, as I mentioned in other times in the past, attacking a messenger was like attacking the king. If a messenger of the king, if I'm a king where I live, and the king from another place sends his messenger, and I violently attack that messenger, it's almost war. It can be a declaration of war, because that messenger bears the word of the king, and the word of the king is law. It's the word of the king is powerful. It also explains some of the mentality about Torah. This is the word of God. This is the word of the king. in the ancient world, kings were the ones who gave laws. The Torah is a unique situation. There's nothing parallel to it. Not even the Code of Hammurabi. The obelisk with the Code of Hammurabi doesn't represent that Hammurabi is receiving a code from his patron god Marduk. It actually seems to be that he is presenting it, that he's receiving a mandate to create laws. So all naysayers out there, oh yeah, the Bible copied. No, there's no copying. There's the whole copy nonsense should be considered nonsense. Period. Poppycock, basically. Copycock. Doesn't matter. And the so what we have here is that we have a messenger, and the text clarifies this isn't the messenger. It's not really God Himself. Might be a surprise to some, might not. Maybe someone's going to try to throw rocks at my window, but I stand behind this opinion. Now, another interesting midrash that we have is about the splitting of the water itself. The text itself says, the waters broke. Okay, this is verses 29. Where's the word baka here? I'm basically combining several verses here together. But the water is split into two. There's a powerful ruach kadim. Ruach kadim usually means an eastern wind. It's possible this was an eastern wind, but we also have to remember that ruach kadim could be idiomatic, which is usually a wind that's very powerful. But if we take the idea that they traveled in that specific location from this basically from the Sinai Peninsula to this Arabian Peninsula, they were traveling from west to east. So an eastern wind to split the waters to travel through there is actually quite reasonable. But in any case, this ruach kadim sometimes represents a very powerful wind. And the Midrash speaks about the idea that each tribe traveled through its own little tunnel, this whole idea of each tribe being unique, and trying to accommodate each individual group inside the Jewish world, inside the Jewish world specifically, because this is a midrash. But the idea is if each group is an individual group and everyone has a place and so on, it's kind of trying to appease everyone. But the text itself doesn't support this. Is the water? The water is split, and the water was a pillar on a wall of water on one side and the other side, which sounds more like what we mostly see in the movies, a split and is traveling through. The Midrashim tend to take things and make them into gigantic, awesome miracles where it's not really necessary. But there's also a point here. There's a reason. There's a way of storytelling and so on. But it's very dangerous to mix Midrashim together with what the text actually says. It's very, very dangerous. I made a recording about this. You can go listen to that recording on YouTube, the Midrashim and Kabbalah. I spoke about that in detail. In any case, one last thing that came up when I was teaching this to my Bible class, which is, by the way, on Sundays, if you're interested, Sundays at 1:15 Eastern Time. It's 8:15 here in Israel in the evening, 1:15 Eastern Time in the United States. Details, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com. You can contact me. One of the things I was asked was, what does it say that Egypt will know that I am the Lord? And one of my students asked a very good question. She said, what does that mean? I mean, why doesn't it say, that they will know that I am the greatest God above all gods and so on, or I am the greatest God? Especially because of the setting here of the idols versus God. The idea is that knowing that He is that Yud He Vav He is God is not the recognition that He's superior to other gods. It's the recognition that there is no other God whatsoever. The concept of knowledge is a very interesting thing. There's a very, very interesting large book that I'm reading through every once in a while. It's a very difficult book to read, but it was written by Professor Meir Malul of the Hebrew University. I tend to quote him every once in a while because he does a lot of interesting anthropological work. And he goes into this whole subject of knowledge, and he talks about the way in the ancient world people were using multi-sensory understanding, which means that when they understood something, understood it on many different levels. Unlike today, that most of us perceive with our eyes and think, but we don't feel, we don't touch, and many of us are cooped in cubicles or offices and so on, so we don't sense the world around us. And then we go on vacations, and on the vacations we're trying to stimulate our brains and do exciting things, when what we need to do is allow the brain to slow down and start absorbing the reality around us. Because sitting in a cubicle which is almost what I do every day. My office is almost like a cubicle. You lose touch with things. So you have to get up, go out, touch, feel the air, touch things, smell. And that's how they perceive things. So the idea here of knowledge is much more embedded. They're not just going to be told. They're going to experience. So yad'u can be understood to some degree, not only the understanding, the final product of comprehension, but the experiencing that he is God. This is when people tell miracle stories, that the experience, it's very important to tell these stories, but it's also very, it's what it does to the person is the experience. When we fully comprehend something is when we experience it. And I think many people out there can attest to this, that when they experience something, they feel it. It's embedded in their system. And that's one of the elements of knowledge in the Bible, the experience, the using all of your senses to actually understand. Then we have the song itself. The song has a very specific structure, poetry. This is not going to be a lesson in poetry, but it tells the story of what happened here. God is presented as an El, Ze Eli va'anveo Elohei aviva umemenu. There's an opening here. We're going to glorify God. There's the whole idea of the right hand in verse 6. Yemincha Adonai nedari bakoach, Yemincha Adonai tir'atz oyev. Your right hand. The right hand was a symbol of strength. Usually in the old world, using your right hand meant that you were normal. Left-handed people were considered to be not normal. We'll call that. I'm not really sure exactly what word to use. And to extent, I actually spoke with someone who grew up in the old world. Man is probably by now he's somewhere in his 90s if he's still around. And he told us the fact that the old education in Eastern Europe was that you had to be right-handed. So if a child started showing signs of being left-handed, they'll actually tie the child. This is, for us today, in modern times, it sounds horrible. But this is what they did because being right-handed was very important. And it actually refers to certain, when individuals were left-handed, they were referred to as iteri yad yamini, that they were weak of the right hand. And there are some people from the tribe of Benjamin that were like this, and a few other characters, one or two characters which were mentioned, which were left-handed. I think it was not Gideon, it was the other guy in the beginning of the book of Judges. Not Gideon, what was his name? Wow, this is annoying. But in any case, in the beginning of the book of Judges, we actually have a person who is left-handed, and he battles Eglon, and we're talking about, where is he? Where is his name? Ehud ben Gera. He was left-handed, so there was a point of pointing this out. But the idea is that strength is usually presented through the right hand, and God is referred to here as an Ish Milchama. There's a lot of a man of war. There's a lot of human metaphors here. And it has brought different researchers to try to claim, the Israelites believe that God had a physical form. But the truth of the matter is that except for some very little representations that might be of the God of Israel, we don't really see much. The most common one quoted is the Kuntilat Ajrud, which is in south of Israel. And the interesting thing is that it's one of the very few representations, and it's also very syncretistic. There's a combination there with other gods, and God is also presented there. It says Yud Hei Vav Hin as his Asherah, but this doesn't prove anything. I've seen a lot of people try to use this to prove that God had a wife and stuff like that, but it's very weak. The fact that it's almost non-existent in Israel, you don't find any representations whatsoever, except for this one site, maybe another site somewhere, but this is the main one that's known to me. You don't find anything, period. And the idea of using human metaphors is really more for the human ear. Rambam says this, and I think he's very right about this, that representation of God in human form is just for our ears, for us to be able to comprehend. However, I will say the following, that the idea of God not having any form whatsoever is not necessarily in the Bible. There are some, first of all, there were many Jews prior to Maimonides, and one of the great critics of Maimonides, the Ra'avad, Rabbi Avraham ben David, criticized this, that believed that God had a physical form. There was some kind of a physical form or some kind of an image that you could see. So Maimonides says that God has no physical form whatsoever. And Ra'avad says many greater and better than him believed he does. And really, when you comb very closely in the biblical text, it does say that, for example, in Deuteronomy it says that you didn't see anything at Mount Sinai, only see a burning fire. But it doesn't prove God does not have a form. Now, again, very important thing, by the way, here is that this is a thought. This is an idea. Okay? This is not necessarily what I believe in. I'm presenting ideas, opinions. Okay? It's important to separate these things. Some interesting information you can read about this is actually in Ben Somer's book, The Bodies of God. You can also find his lectures on iTunes. Very interesting material. It's an interesting debate inside monotheism of Judaism, because what it shows you that even some of the most fundamental ideas that today everyone believes in were not necessarily what everyone believed back then. And it's an interesting thing that I have to deal with all the time, because I'm exposed to this material, and then when people have discussions with me, I have to struggle with the urge of making a point that, well, basically in the past it was a little different. But it's interesting how orthodoxy just believes that whatever we're doing now, it's always been in existence. And it's happened in a lot of places, in a lot of areas of halakha, of theology, and so on. But as an historian, and specifically an historian of Tanakh, an historian who focuses on the faith of the Tanakh, on the Tanakh itself, and what was actually done historically, it's very difficult to accept this as fact. I think that there were a lot of people with a lot of different beliefs out there that were very different than what most of us actually believe today, what most of us understand is the correct belief. And believe me, if I say this to a rabbi, there will be up in arms against me, but we need to realize that historically speaking, what we do today is not what we did in the past, and I think this is true for almost anything in our cultures as human beings. The question is, how much of an issue is it? Okay, if it doesn't go against the basic ideas of halakha or the basic ideas of Torah, depends which group you belong to, then one can say who cares. But it's an interesting subject. Does it matter to me if God has a form or not? No, because it's not a theological point. It's not the point. The point is that he exists, but he's way above and beyond who we are, that it doesn't really matter. He doesn't have. The Bible doesn't really care. And people are fighting one another over things that you can't really prove. So what's the point? What's the point even talking about it? This is one of the questions I have about Maimonides and his pillars of faith. There are certain things I understand. There's certain things I don't really see the point in even talking about it, because how are you going to prove or disprove any of it? It's your philosophical idea. And philosophy is actually contrary to Tanakh. Though there were Jews in the Hellenistic period who tried to prove otherwise. But in any case, we have that. Very interesting verse here, verse 17. As I said, this is not going to be a study of the Song of the Sea, but things that come out from certain sentences or verses, things that can be discussed. It does say, Mikdash Adonai konenu yadecha, the temple of the Lord your hands have established. And there's a lot of discussion about this verse, because why is it even here? What does this actually have to do with the idea of the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, or Yam Suf? And the thing that I wonder about this one all the time is, could it be that there's a connection here between temple of God, throne of God, rulership of God, power of God? That mentioning temple is not the temple. We're actually talking about something more in the cosmic realm, that very similar to some ideas we find in the ancient Near East, when God sits in his temple / palace / throne, he has established his strength. He has established his rulership. He's established his kingship over everything around him. And it's quite possible that this is kind of what we're dealing with. That we are looking at the kingship of God and not and the fact that he defeated his enemies here in the crossing of the sea. And it has nothing to do with the Temple of Jerusalem. That you don't have to argue that there's a preconceived idea here of that there will be a temple. We'll talk about that when we get to the temple. There's some interesting ideas about that. But what I find here is more of a cosmic temple, the temple that represents the rulership of God over the universe, that he's defeated one of the greatest armies and their gods. I was thinking about the idea also of the Egyptians maybe having gods on their chariots and armor and so on. So there's as I said, this showdown between God and the pagan deities. What's interesting is this verse was actually used to argue that the temple, the third temple, the future temple, the temple of Ezekiel, will ascend from heaven. And I think that we can even find this idea already echoing in some places of first century or even first century BC and then first century CE, which actually might present this. And it's a very, very interesting idea. However, as I said, it's not necessarily the case. But you find, for example, especially amongst the Gaonites, Rav Hai-Gaon, which I will expand upon when I do my program about the Gaonites on the Oral Torah series. We basically have I would say, a lot of response, and people were asking a lot of similar questions that people ask today. There's not really much new in the world. And what happens is that he was asked about the future redemption, and he says a lot of things like we don't necessarily know, it's not that simple to know, and so on, things which are really very down to earth. But he does mention this idea that there are those who believe the temple will come down from heaven. And I think, if I remember correctly, the answer I read back then, the response there is that, and this is several years back, that he says that some people use this verse, and you look at some Jewish commentary about this verse, they'll tell you that this is what it means. But again, it's not the pshat, it's not what the simple words mean. They cross the sea, and they actually have this substance called the manna. It's called man in Hebrew. And it's interesting, that's the name, not the discussion of what it's made from and so on, but the name itself, man. They called it man because they said manhu. Man is kind of an abbreviation of the whole idea of what is this. Manna basically means, what is this stuff? I'm trying to be a little funny about this, but their response was, what is this? What is this stuff here that we're eating here? Where is this substance? And what's very interesting is the fact that's what they named it. So it's this thing they can't really define. So one has to ask this question, so if they were unable to define it, they were actually dealing with it with their own hands, how would we be able to define it? It gives, it was sweet, a little cracker in honey. There was something very pleasurable about it. But we don't really know what it was. They didn't know. But I've seen a lot of people try to explain what the manna is. And I'm saying, leave it. It won't work. It doesn't work. They themselves didn't know what it was. Now, it's interesting here, we hear about the Shabbat. We hear about Shabbat and we hear about Amalek. There's a lot of stuff that can be said here. Shabbat, actually, I will expand upon Shabbat in the Yitro, so I'll go back to this one. But what's very interesting here is that the Shabbat, the limitations here of Shabbat is actually going out and just gathering out in the field. That, what am I doing? I'm just picking something here. A lot of people talk about the concept of work, and sometimes things which seem to be kind of simple can be considered work. So I'm walking down the road and there's an apple tree and I pick an apple. Is that forbidden? Maybe. The story of the manna actually presents that. So the question of what is Shabbat and how Shabbat works is probably going to be one of the main focuses of the reading that we're going to do for Parashat Yitro. Parashat Yitro is going to be mostly Shabbat, very specific commandments, and some things about the temple and the altar. That's going to be the focus there. But there's an interesting verse here as well. So besides going out and gathering, which is obviously a type of work here, which connects to field work, a lot of scholars say that there's a connection to field work when the prohibition of Shabbat shows up. But the other thing here we have as well is verse 23. It says, tomorrow is a Sabbath. Et asher tofu efu. That's which you will bake, you will bake. V'shetot tevashelu bashelon. That which you cook, you will cook. V'et kol ha'odef anichu lachem mishmeret ad bokar. He says, bake what you bake, cook what you cook, and all the rest you leave for tomorrow. There is an understanding, and if we link it to the end of the book of Exodus, the prohibition of fire, that you're not supposed to cook on Shabbat. That the verse clearly identifies that you can cook and bake whatever you want now. Whatever you have left, you leave for tomorrow. So it seems to be that he's having a preparation day here. You prepare everything today, bake what you bake, cook what you cook. Whatever you have left is left for tomorrow, and it has to stay in that state. It's one way of reading it. I know people who do cook on Shabbat. I've presented this verse before them, asked them what they think. Some of them said, oh, it does seem you're not supposed to cook. Some of them said, oh, no, it's something else. They weren't really clear about it, but they were trying to say the element of, oh, you leave for tomorrow, and tomorrow you can also cook as well. Okay. I disagree with that interpretation, but it seems to be that he's saying whatever's left, you leave for tomorrow. And that's it. And he doesn't say, oh, and tomorrow you can cook. So the fact that he says leave it for tomorrow, baked and cooked today, and whatever's left, leave it for tomorrow, seems as if he's excluding the cooking and the baking. Feels like it. You can disagree with me. I'm fine with that. And the last thing we actually have here, because we're already beyond the 50 minutes, the whole thing with Amalek. Why does the Torah say that you can commit, I would say, a genocide of an entire nation? Or actually, it's not a nation; it's really a tribe. It's really Amalek was probably loads and loads of different groups, but this is a specific group of Amalek. Why are we told that we have to destroy them? But on the other hand, by the way, if they convert, it's perfectly fine. The reason is, in certain situations, when you have an enemy that's willing to attack you no matter what, you need to defend yourself no matter what. And this enemy is going to continue attacking you. And this is what happens with Amalek. Mortal enemy of Israel. So it's an eternal struggle. It's a struggle that's going to carry on for a very long time. But in our Western mind of today, it's very difficult for us to fathom this idea. I remember I was sitting with a rabbi in Jerusalem. He was giving a talk about the whole thing of Amalek. And he said to people, do you even realize what it means to do this? We can't fathom this today. This goes against our westernized culture. To go and kill a nation, especially after the Holocaust, it's shocking to us. Yeah, and for those who say, what about the Palestinians? They are fighting against us. This is a war. It's a completely different case. But the idea itself, I sometimes say, thank God that we don't know who Amalek is today. So, we don't have to start trying to find out the DNA of Amalek and finding them. That we don't have to deal with that anymore. But the idea itself, the whole thing with Amalek, even after the crossing of the Red Sea, of the Sea of Reeds, even after all the miracles that are happening, even after defeating Egypt, Amalek is this rabid dog that tries to attack, senselessly, tries to attack Israel. These are the madmen of the world. You can do whatever metaphors and ideas and whoever you want to throw it at, but these are people that deliberately ignore everything because they just want that. They want to go there, they want to do that, they don't care. And God says, these are people who are not just attacking you, they are rebelling against me. And the same way God had to bring judgment on Egypt, on the people in the flood, and other situations, on Ashur, Bavel, same thing. But in this case, God says, they are your eternal enemy and you need to eradicate them. Because, and actually God says, I will make sure the name of Amalek is gone. So if there's something here that God will bring that will destroy Amalek, and I'm not going to point fingers who Amalek is because we really don't know. But the point is that Amalek symbolizes the ultimate rebellion. Even after everything, they went out and said, we don't care. They're basically, you can compare them as to lunatics. These are the lunatics of the world. Amalek represents the insane. Amalek represents the ones that they start fires just because they want to see the world burn. And Amalek is the antithesis of human reality. That they go and attack just because they can. And God is a creator of life. There's no good God, bad God. There's no God and devil. One represents life, one represents death. God represents life, and that's the only element, the only power that exists. And Amalek is the human creation, is the human concept that stands in the opposition to God. And God says, listen, it's not going to work. I am still God, and I've proven this over and over again. But this might be some of the philosophy behind, if I could use this Greek term, the philosophy behind the whole thing of Amalek. That they represent the antithesis of God. And for them to attack the God is to attack Israel. But the attack is actually against God. The offense is actually against God, not Israel. And this is why God says here, I will erase them. I would eradicate their name from the world. Because they represent the antithesis of who God is. In any case, hope you enjoyed this. Hope the new sound is better. And that this gives you a much better sound and everything. I want to thank you again for joining me. Don't forget to share this material, share it on your Facebook, share it with your friends, and spread the word that these recordings exist. I want to thank everyone for joining me again, for listening to the prior recordings. I highly recommend go through my YouTube channel or through my website so you can find all the different recordings I've done and all the different teachings and so on. And go to the blog. And if you're interested, there's a Bible lesson and Hebrew lessons that I offer. You can look all that on the website HebrewInIsrael.wix.com. I know the whole Wix thing is not that great, but that's the name I'm using for now. Also, if there are any questions, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com, Hebrew in Israel, one word. And again, thank you for joining me, and Shabbat Shalom.